Hello and welcome to this episode of the Leading Lives podcast. One of the most well-known annual events in the UK is Bournemouth Air Festival. And with me today is a key player in making that all happen. It's Air Festival Director Jon Weaver. Hello Jon, thanks for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
Local guy?
Yeah, been born and bred, went to school in Ferndown and basically worked in sports centres around here and then eventually moving down to work for the local authority in Bournemouth.
You had a full career with Bournemouth Council and latterly, of course, that became BCP Council. What made you want to work in the public sector?
Well, my background was in sports and leisure management. I went to college in Farnborough and I very soon, early on, went to work at Ferndown Sports Centre. So my background has always been in leisure management. And then I got involved in working for the LTA, running some tennis centres up in Wales, and then came back down to Bournemouth in the 90s. Oh, well, actually, it was early 90s, 1990, and got a job as the marketing and events officer for Bournemouth Borough Council.
Wow. And that's, I think, where we first met, when you were at Bournemouth Council and in the early days of your tourism stuff, I think.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I suppose it's one of the highlights of your career, Bournemouth Air Festival came along. 2008, I think it was.
That's right. It was a 2008, yes.
What was the thinking behind the Air Festival in the first place?
Well, at that time, I have to say that I was working with my director of tourism at the time, Mark Smith, and he was the inspiration behind it. I was the person who basically had to make it happen with virtually no budget and nothing to sort of work on. But the idea was to say, look, Bournemouth at that time was a resort where people would come down, they booked to stay, and they would then decide what they might do, where they might go, probably spending a lot of their time on the beach. And the idea is we wanted to do something a bit different, where the decision to come down to Bournemouth was driven by the event itself. And by doing that, we could do a few things which people wouldn't think of. So, for example, if you established the reputation of that event, the hotels could suddenly premium rate those 4 or 5 days, and suddenly and they got guaranteed bookings, and at that time there was the internet and online bookability for holidays was really starting to take off. So the whole piece was around doing something that did that, but also something that would attract a huge amount of people down to the town. And there aren't any other events and air shows that really can achieve that. I mean, at the time, the stat that we put together was that after football, air shows had the highest number of spectators.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a stat, that was put together, but it was. There aren't any other events that are similar to that can attract those sort of numbers. And I think that was the thinking. It was about raising profile. It was about getting bookability in there. It was those things. And actually, the other thing was, it was always important to make sure that local people were proud of the town and what it achieved, and they were involved.
Was it always going to be an annual event?
Yes, it was always going to be an annual event. People did talk about biannual, but I think the thing is that you can do it if you're something like Farnborough Air Show, which did, but that was a business to business piece with a bit of sort of end piece of visitors coming, and enjoying it. Really, it had to build that momentum.
I remember when we were first talking about it in 2008, that you were at great pains to point out that it wasn't an air show. It was more than an air show. It was an air festival. Explain the difference.
That was the big USP. And we came up with this idea, and we changed how air shows were looked at, because we said, hold on, most air shows, it's probably an afternoon, maybe a couple of afternoons for a couple of hours, and people would come down, and mainly aimed at the air enthusiast who loved it. And we went, well, do you know what? We want something that actually is bigger than that, which is as I said, more than just an air show. We wanted something. There was something for people to do from 10 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock in the evening. And so the first thing we did, even in the first year, is that instead of just having that afternoon show, we had the morning. We opened up at 10 o'clock. We had all this what I call county show feel, which people could enjoy, and then we had an evening show. In that first year, it was mainly in the gardens. We had a lady dancing in the air in a helium balloon, and we had bands playing.
Oh, the balloon, I remember that.
Do you remember the balloon, the helium balloon with that? Yeah. And we went, this has to be something different that we can have that USP.
Because you had, wasn't it, reptiles and raptors and things? That was it as well?
We had that. And over the years, of course, it built to something, in its heyday, sort of up to about 2015, 2016, the whole piece really changed shape. Yeah,
and I think it was always popular in the evenings, the Royal Marines, the band playing and stuff as well, wasn't it? Yeah. What also happened was that you introduced night air after a couple of years, didn't you?
We did, yeah.
What was the first one?
I think it was 2009, I think it was early as that.
Yeah.
And the way that came about was that there was a couple of guys who just started experimenting with pyros, fireworks to everybody else, on aircraft. And you could imagine the sort of the shock horror of the CA, Civil Aviation Authority, at doing this. But however, it'd been done in the States for a long time, and actually their night shows are quite spectacular. And we managed to get them down, and they did that. The first, I think we're quite confident to say it was the first ever night air display with pyros in the country.
Oh right, I remember actually speaking with the Red Devils, who initially weren't involved in the festival, but they were clients of ours at the time, and I was pleading with them to get involved, and they actually offered me a jump in return. I don't know if I've ever told you that. I didn't do it, but yeah, it was terrific, the night air, wasn't it?
It was great, and of course they have the pyros coming out the boots, which they'd have done. To be fair, that had been done for quite some time, but it was smoke, and then they did the pyros. So yeah, it was a very, very unique thing at that time.
You mentioned that there was no budget. Can you remember what your first budget was?
I do. My first budget was £126,000,
and now the council said it's what for?
Well, at the time the actual we subsidised it. The last Air Festival was actually £325,000.
Yeah.
But at a cost of nearly £800,000. And most of that was through. It's when it became so successful that people just said, the infrastructure and the health and safety management and the security management had to match it, and those costs escalated over a period of 10 years quite substantially.
We're going to come on to that a bit more. You mentioned also about hotels being full. Some of the years of the Air Festival were over bank holiday weekends, and I remember speaking to local hoteliers saying, "Well, we're going to be full anyway." And there was a little bit of reticence to support you, I think, financially from the.
There was. I mean, we used to have it right. Well, first of all, we had it right in the middle of the summer holidays, and people just said, "Why are you doing this?" Because we're full. And at the time, there were two key things that we made at the time. First of all, where there was displacement, so people would actually go for other weeks outside it, so they weren't going to lose booking was our contention. And the second thing was that they were going to get so much per night. They would over those days at that peak season, they could drive those costs. Those revenues and rack rates even higher, and so that was and in those days, I think when it very first started, then I think that was sort of accepted reluctantly, I have to say, but it was accepted.
One of the other difficulties, particularly at the start, was getting sponsors, wasn't it? And how difficult was that?
Well, this is my old sort of argument I have with everybody, and it's still today. People just say, "You've got this massive event. What you cannot? You mean to tell me you cannot get big sponsors?" And you have to say you've got to look at this very differently within a commercial perspective. there are many other shows that don't achieve that sponsorship. In fact, we achieved the highest number. But it's a halfway house. To really get large sponsorship, you've got to either have national or international media coverage, which an air show, I don't think you can actually make that interesting for people to watch at home for that long. Or B, you've got to be able to have that relationship and build that relationship with those people visiting, getting them to hook up to the social media. Well, it was a free event. So obviously, a ticketed event would be something completely different. You could get people's email addresses and you could get their social media profiles and start creating those relationships. So you were really stuck with something that didn't really achieve, and still, it's been difficult. You have to understand where you focus your commercials. And where we were getting the big commercial, the big growth, was on our trading on the seafront.
Yeah.
That was where it was. It wasn't going to be there. That was where and that built hugely. I mean, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think last year it was one of the biggest trading income streams that the Air Festival ever had. And it's understanding that.
And sticking with that for a minute, there was some criticism that the trading stands along the beach, especially the food outlets, were from companies that came in and they didn't bring anything into the area. Was that a fair criticism, do you think?
I don't think it was fair. I think if you look at actually particularly some of the street food. So yes, the bars were tendered.
Yeah,
they were tendered out, and you would get not international. You would get UK-based companies. Having said that, you also got local companies who won it and bid it, who won and bid for the contracts. But a lot of the street food sellers were, I would say, local, if not regional,
right.
And selling a wide variety of food. Yeah, there was a degree of that, but it was I wouldn't say it was as big as people would make out.
One of the key elements of the Air Festival was the support of the military. How did you go about getting them to support you in the first place and to bring their, not insubstantial assets? And there was wars going on at the time as well, 2008.
Yeah. I think, again, we had the right people in the right places, the right contacts. What you do get is that, particularly with the armed forces, that they see the air shows as a recruitment, a sort of asset, and therefore they would come down, bring their villages, and they would just generally do that. But particularly with the Royal Navy, they took it on board, and there was a guy at the time who was in charge of recruitment called Commodore Jamie Miller.
Yep, I remember.
You remember him, and he really took this on board and saw the potential, and then he invested in a lot of other additional pieces as well, and really built on the social side of it. Got the bands involved, and he really went to town. So I think there was a combination of people, particularly in the Royal Navy, and the fact that it became a big event, and they suddenly thought, wow, this is a recruitment place we can't miss. Put a lot of effort into it to really make it something quite special. They brought the ships in, and they did all sorts of other things. And the beach assault was part of their piece as well. So a lot of engagement there.
What about logistics for large events such as this? Give me some tidbits about the kind of things that went on in the background and in the planning.
Well, planning was almost all year round. If you start from almost September after the event, you massive debrief about how we can improve things, and that went on for a couple of months. Then you start going into the procurement piece. There's some big bits of kit you've got to procure. A PA system. I mean, there is something like 9 or 10 miles of PA across the seafront, and you've got all the porter cabins, the generators,
the Harris fencing,
huge amount of Harris fencing that's involved in all of that. And then you've got the income generation, production. You have to start thinking about, bringing in all the trading. So you have to set up all the sort of the designs of how you're going to let the site plans, and then go out and sell it. And then on top of that, you have all the sort of safety planning, crowd dynamics. You have to do crowd calculations, and you engage different people in that, and where the pinch points are, and watch the flows, and then put in all the sort of planning processes about pieces like that.
How accurate were your planning? Were your crowd predictions?
They were, interestingly, in the beginning, as you might expect, you learnt a lot. I do remember there were certain pinch points, but every year you tested that, you got better and better at it, and in the end you got it right. And we had very few issues in terms of crowd density. We had a specialist person appointed who would look at all the crowd densities and the movements, because we had cameras everywhere, and could look at where the flows were. Always, I tell people, if you know that you've got an issue, if you go into what we call the penguin walk situation, right. So if people are walking like penguins because it's so crowded, then it's pretty compact. And the other thing is, when you have no decision about where you're going to go, you have to follow the flow.
Yeah.
Those are the things that you look at, and then you have to think about how you can relieve those, how you can address them and relieve the crowds.
Every time that I saw you at the festival, you looked in varying degrees of hot, bothered and stressed, I think. But you enjoyed it.
I did enjoy it. One of the things you do learn if you are in big events, and funny enough, this is something that I got from the police and the way that they were, is that it was very easy to jump in, roll your sleeves up and sort a problem out. And I got caught out a few times with that. And I remember there was a police officer who took me to one side and he said, "Your job is not to move fencing and barriers around when it all hits the fan. Your job is to sit back, watch it and make strategic decisions." And he said, and also you're number two, the same, because you guys were used to a small events where you could do that without too much problem. But when you come to this side, you've got to have a proper command structure. You've got to be able to, when it starts looking a bit iffy, to be able to stand back and work with your different teams, and depending on what the issue is, and make decisions and take action.
I suppose one of the things that made that a little more difficult for you, that delegation, was that you were very hands-on. I mean, we were involved as a company from 2008, and we dealt with you. And so therefore, when we were at the Air Festival, we thought, who do we need to speak to? We go and speak to Jon.
Yeah.
And and that's the thing I suppose you learned over the years, that you needed to deflect us onto people, like Michelle, Helen, and Steve, who was there as well. And
absolutely. And actually, by the end of it, the last 3 or 4 years, I have to say, I was just sitting there observing, seeing where we could make improvements, and being there to make the decisions if it went wrong, and taking people around and showing them. And by the end of it, I was a completely different type of director than I was in 2008.
What was your favourite part of the festival itself?
I think funny enough, about the favourite part was actually when everything started to kick off in terms of the entertainment program, and when you saw the Reds, and then you got over your first day, and that was really, you felt you were moving forward and achieving something. So it's not necessarily the favourite bits. There weren't really favourite bits, because you would just like to see the impact of everything that you were doing was really working well, and you were getting really good positive feedback from the press, from the media and everything else. That was my favourite.
What about a display that was you always wanted to see?
Well, I was often asked this question about what's your favourite display, and I would say, well, if you, in a nutshell, probably the Vulcan Bomber was my favourite. Probably because it was just so big and so massive, and the impact was incredible. The Reds, obviously they were the anchor attraction. They were your Marks and Spencers. You needed the Reds, and they brought in. We estimated the uplift when they came was about 10% uplift, which was good. So if you want to talk about that sort of impact, but I've always been a bit of a, I call it, and they'll hate me for saying it, a bit of an anorak on the stuff like this.
Most people would know that.
Yeah. And, I used to build airfix kits and things like that. And I liked the variety, and I loved to see anything from the Chinook helicopter to an aerobatic display. Loved seeing them, and just seeing the variety was great.
What about the Wingwalkers? Ever have a go yourself?
No, never would touch that. And but they were brave.
When we were doing the DVD in the early years, there was a guy who came to see us every year, and he was, late 80s, and age-wise, and he used to come to us and buy the DVD every year, and he said to us that wing walking was one of his great passions, and he'd been with the team, Breitling as it was originally, and he'd been with them a few times. Quite amazing. And he was in his late 80s. When I think back to the Air Festival, one year stands out above all the others, perhaps for the wrong reasons, and that was 2011. It was an extraordinary year for the Air Festival. It started off badly, let's be honest. What happened on the Thursday? Remind everybody.
Well, we had what's it they call it nowadays, which is always makes me laugh, a once in a generation or once in a 100-year weather event was the best way I described it. Basically, this massive great cloud came primarily over Bournemouth, primarily over the lower gardens and our sort of display area, and dumped millions of gallons of water in about 2 hours. And what you saw was the most phenomenal sights I've never seen. To wit, a guy in a kayak literally canoe down the middle of the lower gardens, seeing sort of waterfalls going over the cliff top. Very, very demanding situation, and that was your first time we were into a major incident planning, and really we hadn't really been in any form of major incident before, and that's when you saw the decisions about making very hard decisions about, right, okay, how long is this going to last? Do we do a major evacuation? Well, fortunately, the rain took care of that. Everybody evacuated because it was too heavy. But then you had to start worrying about, right, you then had to do all the scenarios. And you suddenly went, right, what other things do we need to consider? And as you were doing that, you suddenly realised that, of course, there was almost the major incident wasn't just within the air show area, the Air Festival area. It was the whole of the Bournemouth. And suddenly you had to then work with the other major incident planners who were looking at a council-wide incident with all the flooding that was going on in Bournemouth Town Centre and the surrounding areas, as well as of dealing with your own site. So it was an extraordinary piece where people were having to coordinate and make decisions from an air festival perspective, but also making decisions from a town-wide perspective about how we would address it.
I remember that on that Thursday afternoon, there was grave doubts as to whether the Air Festival would continue. But by Friday, the clouds, or those black clouds, had lifted. And there, if I remember rightly, I think even on the Friday, it was blue skies. But on Saturday, darker clouds descended on Bournemouth, even though it was sunny.
Yeah, obviously that was with the John Egging and the fatal air crash, which sticks in your mind. I remember, like you do with many incidences, when you first heard, and obviously we heard it very, very quickly, and after they displayed. And I always say to people when they ask me about it, I remember I was up on the top in the sort of major, it's a command centre, looking out over the bay, and I suddenly saw the Bronze Command police officer at the time, and he was quite a fit, agile guy, and he basically was running towards me, and there was I know this sounds a bit odd, but there was a tow bar, it was quite high, and he leaped over this massive sort of tow bar, which was on the back of a big truck. He flew over it, running at us, and then said, "Red's gone down."
Yeah.
And the feeling in your body was just numbness.
Yeah.
At what happens next.
We were filming for you on the beach, and we'd obviously just seen the red arrows flying overhead, and we were talking to people on the beach about how they'd enjoyed it. And my phone pinged, and actually a friend of mine was over in the area where where John Eggings playing Red 4 crashed, and he sent me a message saying, "I've just seen a Red Arrows plane crash." Now I reckon we knew that before anybody, because he was right on. Right on hand, and saw it go down. Yeah, it was a horrendous time, horrendously difficult for you.
Yeah, I mean, the first decision was when we got together, when the sort of the command team got together, was right. What we've got to decide whether the show should go on or whether it should stop. The decision was then made, well, we must try and continue with the show so that people wouldn't think that anything's particularly changed. But we knew that with social media at the time and other things, it was going to build and build and build. And somehow we managed to keep a display together, basically through aircraft that wasn't based at the airport, because obviously the airport was shut down.
Yeah.
But it did build, and by the end of that display, everybody knew what had happened. And then then we had to sort of take the lead at that time was purely from the Royal Air Force. We couldn't say anything. We were purely driven by what they wanted to say. And the first thing was that everybody wanted to say, well, they worked out, it's somehow people slowly worked out who it was.
Yeah.
How they probably process of elimination, and they kept on saying that, they kept on pushing, it is him, and we said we cannot say until we absolutely know and get that final confirmation. So that was very difficult. And then after that, as you said, the next decision is, well, do we go or do we don't? Or do we sort of stop the whole display? It was Saturday. Do we go with Sunday? And the decision was based on a principle about it's the decision of the other display pilots whether they wanted to continue. Mm-hmm. The RAF were not going to make it say one way or the other. That was not their decision. So we asked them, and and at that time their view was, yes, we wanted to continue. We wanted to continue because that's what, in their view, any display pilot would want if the same thing happened, and just to show and to really and to a degree there was a respect. And it was a hard day Sunday, and I have to say we'd put this piece together right at the beginning of the air show display. It was put together by George Bacon, who's sort of nationally sort of one of the top air display representatives, and that was very, very, very hard. And they did a fly past, and it was just like, whoa, you were really quite, you were. Some people, well, obviously people were in tears and things, and it was quite, but it was good. It was quite, it worked well, and we got through it.
And afterwards, the town, of course, came together in memory of John. Yeah,
and I always say to people, and it's very controversial, and I remember this, that it was a tribute and not memorial.
Yeah.
And people were insulted. I said, from my perspective, from what I heard, is that because he was doing something he loved and he wasn't in battle, that it was a tribute. And I remember that the Emma said it was something he wanted to celebrate.
Yeah, Emma, his wife, of course.
Yeah, Emma, his wife, of course. Yeah, and I remember, we wanted to make sure it still is called a memorial. And I understand. I don't get, we don't get upset about it. We understand how people do it, and I do remember that if in sort of the years that went by, people put flowers down on there, and we used to sort of, it was a very delicate balance to say. In the first years we didn't take anything of it, but I remember people a few years later used to sort of sit on there and things, and people were absolutely, this is just disgusting what you're doing. And I say, well, yes, it is. I understand, how much, quite understandably, how you feel, but I think it was a tribute to him, and the fact is, and I think it is what it was. It was what he loved, and it's good that memory continues.
Going forward just a few years to 2015, of course, further along the coast, there was the events at Shoreham, and that was the same weekend as Bournemouth Air Festival, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And although it wasn't directly related, a lot of the pilots would have been displaying it both, I imagine.
Yeah, they would have. Yes, I think. I can't. To be honest, I can't quite remember. Maybe,
but they used to, didn't they? They used to.
Wingwalkers would have done. Yes, you're right. Wingwalkers would have probably done.
How did that impact you as far as organising the Air Festival, both in the immediate aftermath on that Saturday and for the Sunday, of course, and then longer term planning as well, because things changed?
Well, we made a decision again to continue. We felt that we were basically, because we were sea based as well. Our site was had a greater degree of a cover, shall we say, in terms of if things went wrong, it would go straight into the sea and not into land, and
But longer term, it pushed the flight, the datum line pushed it further out, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, they went from primaries to second. They talked about primary and secondary crowd. So we were always focusing on the primary crowd, which was on the beach, but the secondary crowd was all those yachts and boats.
Yeah.
So suddenly, like you said, we suddenly had to push everything out, make it much bigger, much wider, and we had to think about those boats and those boats and yachts. Then there was different ground minima on approach. It was all sorts of things like that, and it did sort of give us some concern that the spectacle might reduce, but in the end it didn't, and it worked quite well, actually.
You've directed, what was it, 15, 16?
About 15 shows, I think, because we had COVID.
Looking back on it, you've already mentioned about the delegation, but what else would you do differently now, or did you do differently at the end of that period rather than at the beginning?
Yeah. Well, like you said, the biggest one for me was the management of it. What I would have probably done differently is made sure that people understood what the show is all about, and about the fact that it's broader than just the displays, and it's broader than just that focus. I think it's quite difficult to think about those things that you would have done differently, because I think we just learnt all the time that we had to comply with all the different health and safety measures, all the different counter-terrorism measures that kicked in, and we had to accept that. I suppose the other thing was to look at our costs a lot more, sort of microscopically, focused on our income generation and knowing where it was, and got everybody on board to say this is where we need to focus not focus it on sponsorship. And they'll still say today, I still think this place has got sponsorship, and I know I harp on about it, but it's actually focus on things that matters. And there was a lot of distraction where I felt, if you just let us focus on where we think the money is going to be made, instead of then going off and to these other sort of intransigent pieces, which we felt wasn't going to actually generate significant value. I think that those are the sort of things that we learnt, and it was definitely an interesting time towards the end.
And you mentioned the end there. I mean, 2024 was the last agreed Air Festival. There's none in 2025.
Yeah.
Just in a couple of sentences, do you feel that there's any possibility that the event will return, maybe 26 or 7?
I hope it returns in 26. There was, as everybody knows, Pacific Air Shows was the company from America. And from my early on discussions with them, they had said to me that they've got the show in in America. They've got the show in Australia on the Gold Coast, and actually, which we all know, the setting of the bay and the sandy beaches was just fitted with their idea of where they could fit their type of operation. To make it pay, bottom line comes down to the fact that you've got to start charging people in some form or another, and they did that successfully in Huntington Beach. They did charge, and the administration and the council, they accepted that as well, and but there are a lot of logistical pieces they need to sort of look at this moment in time. I think it's fairly quiet at the moment, but obviously there might be discussions going on behind the scenes. Yeah. And I hope something can happen, but we'll see.
We've got about 5 minutes or so left, and I want to move it on to the here and now and what you're doing now. You've taken a step back from your role in the council, and you've set up a freelance enterprise, I understand.
Yeah, I've called myself Alpha One Events Management, and the reason why that Alpha One, people think, oh, well, you do that because it's A and everything. No, it's actually my call sign for the last 15 years was Alpha One.
Right.
And everybody used to talk about it, and it was always a bit of a joke, so it's Alpha One calling and stuff like that. So I decided, well, just for a bit of a laugh, I'd do that. And that's been a very different departure. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm at my age, shall we say, where I have other income streams, which I don't have to worry about too much, and I can really decide what I want to do with that, what I want to pick and choose, and I want to have. I want to have a purpose. I am still passionate about events, and really passionate about telling people that the importance of events, which people don't really get, they see it as a cost in terms of a financial cost.
Yeah, that's a big thing, isn't it? I mean, you and I are the same age, 47 for those that are watching, and
plus.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about it before we started the recording. That there comes a time when you want to take it a little bit easier, but you hit the nail on the head. You still want to be useful, and you still want to have a role. It's one reason I do this, actually.
Yeah.
But throughout your time with the council, sometimes you took some criticism. As it's just the way that trolls are out there. How did you deal with that?
I think I would always listen to what they have to say.
Even if you didn't want to.
Well, I think because it's a percentage game. Out of the 100 comments, there will be nuggets of information or nuggets of comment that had validity.
Yep.
A lot of it, as you would expect, is not understanding. But then I can't blame them. They're not running the show. The things about, oh, well, it's a boring old festival because it's the same old aircraft that comes every year. And goodness me, can't you get the Americans involved?
Yeah.
And you go, you have no idea how difficult it is to do that. But I would say to people, it isn't just an air show. And by the way, hundreds of thousands of people still come down to enjoy those. We try and mix it up and get a few bits and pieces. So I listen to that and say, well, I'll see what I can do. And so I think you've also got to be very hard-headed. I remember I had to make a decision one year that I couldn't fly the Vulcan for a display on the Saturday because there was a combination of there was the Arrows and others competing, and I said the Vulcan can only do a fly past because the numbers coming down could create crowd crush issues. And I made the front page and I was lambasted. Oh, you're Mr. Health and Safety, you're this and you're the other. And it's just like, and you go, I don't care, because you can tell me that, but if that had all gone wrong and there was crowd crush, I'd rather be slated.
How did you deal with the mental pressures? Like, for example, you've done all this work and then you get bad weather. It could just be low cloud, and it's ruined your day. And it's
you are this nail on the head job. The weather was the biggest thing that stressed you out, and I used to be watching it a week in a week, sort of just checking it. And I remember I learnt the lesson: don't do that. And I used to leave it till Tuesday or Wednesday. But yeah, if it's a bad weather day, big sigh, hold your breath. Not brilliant. And like with everything in events, just take one step at a time, see what happens. Things fundamentally changed. I remember some events I've done where basically the weather was absolutely forecasted as dreadful, and it changed. It does happen. But it is. I mean, those things always make you can get you down, but you have to deal with it, and it's hard.
What about the importance of the team around you? You mentioned it in brief earlier.
Yeah, well, I think I talked about the fact that I was a bit too hands-on. And I needed to step back. You have to have that team that you can really trust, and I had over the years a great team. I had somebody who's now doing very well in the council now, and the two of them who are solid deliverers. You could trust them to put everything together to make it all happen.
What's the single piece of advice, apart from don't, would you give to somebody who's about to organise a massive event like the Air Festival?
Single piece of advice is you need a lot of passion, because there's going to be massive ups and massive downs.
Yeah.
And you've just got to believe in yourself and believe that what you're doing is going to have that benefit. And you really need to do that. And as you said before, make sure you've got a good team behind you that can support you, and know what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. Because I learned that. I knew what I was good at, and I wasn't. Make sure you understand that.
Last question. So Sunday evening after the Air Festival has just finished, and I know you're already thinking about next year, but you go home. How did you feel on those Sunday evenings?
I think I felt relief. Relief was one word. Pride was another.
Yeah.
And loved that feeling, and wanted to get to think how I can improve for next year.
Yeah, well, as I said, we've come to the end of the show. We've actually gone over 40
wow.
minutes, which is quite impressive, really. So yeah, I think we've had a great time. Actually, it's been
great.
Really interesting. I wanted to talk about more things, but couldn't do it, so we ran out of time. That's it for this week's episode of Leading Lives. I need your help, please. If you know someone who has a great story to tell, please ask them to get in touch with me directly. We're looking for people all the time. So see you soon, and thanks again to Jon.
Thank you.
Cheers.